In the 1840s, a disease entered the soil of Ireland. It did not carry a flag. It did not fire a bullet. It did not march with soldiers. It appeared as black rot on a potato. But what followed was not just a natural disaster. It became hunger, then eviction, then migration, then political revenge. The Great Hunger pushed millions of Irish people toward death, exile, and survival. Families who had once lived from the land were forced onto ships so dangerous they became known as Coffin Ships. They arrived in America starving, poor, Catholic, hated, and unwanted. But within a few generations, those same refugees became police officers, firefighters, ward bosses, mayors, governors, senators, and eventually presidents. This is the story of how hunger became organization, how trauma became political discipline, and how the Irish did not simply enter America. They rewired the American political machine from the inside. For millions of Irish peasants in the 1840s, the potato was not a side dish. It was life. A single family could survive on potatoes because the crop was cheap, dense, and could grow on small plots of poor land. But this dependence made Ireland dangerously vulnerable. When potato blight arrived in 1845, it spread with terrifying speed. The leaves blackened. The roots turned to slime. Food disappeared from the ground. But the disaster did not happen in a political vacuum. Ireland was under British rule. Much of the land was owned by landlords, many of whom did not live among the people who worked it. Grain, cattle, butter, and other food products still moved through the economy, while the poor starved. For the Irish peasant, this was the cruelty of empire made visible. They were not only dying from crop failure, they were dying inside a system that treated hunger as an economic problem instead of a human emergency. This is why many Irish families remembered the famine not as bad luck, but as betrayal. The blight attacked the potato, but policy decided who would live. When relief failed, when evictions continued, when workhouses filled, and when families watched children die from hunger and disease, one truth.
For many Irish families, America was not a dream. It was the last exit before death. They sold what little they had. They borrowed money. They accepted tickets from landlords who wanted them gone. They boarded ships with almost nothing except grief, faith, and memory. These ships were overcrowded, filthy, and dangerous. Below deck, hundreds of people were packed into dark spaces with little air, poor sanitation, and limited food. Disease spread quickly. Fever, cholera, typhus, and hunger followed them across the Atlantic. Some passengers died before ever seeing land. That is why these vessels became known as coffin ships. But the deepest wound was not only physical, it was psychological. Imagine leaving your village, knowing you may never see it again. Imagine watching your parents disappear into a workhouse. For many Irish families, America was not a dream. It was the last exit before death. They sold what little they had. They borrowed money. They accepted tickets from landlords who wanted them gone. In cities like New York and Boston, the Irish found themselves crowded into the lowest levels of urban life. They lived in tenements where disease spread easily. They worked the hardest jobs for the lowest pay. They dug canals, built railroads, unloaded docks, cleaned streets, and entered domestic service. But the city gave them one thing Ireland had denied them: numbers. In Ireland, a starving tenant could be evicted, ignored, or replaced. In America, that same tenant could become a voter. And when thousands of them lived in the same neighborhood, attended the same churches, drank in the same saloons, worked the same docks, and remembered the same hunger, they became more than immigrants. They became a bloc. This was the first great Irish-American political transformation. The Irish realized that democracy was not only an ideal, it was a machine. And machines could be operated. In the crowded wards of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago, Irish organizers began to understand the city at street level. They knew who needed coal in winter. They knew whose son needed a job. They knew which widow needed rent money. They knew who had just arrived from Ireland and needed help becoming a citizen. This was not abstract politics. This was survival politics. The Irish did not wait for polite reformers to rescue them. They traded unity for protection. Vote together and the machine will answer. Vote together and your family will not freeze. Vote together and your cousin may get a city job. Vote together and the landlord may think twice. Vote together and the police officer on your block may finally know.
In cities like New York and Boston, the Irish found themselves crowded into the lowest levels of urban life. They lived in tenements where disease spread easily. They worked the hardest jobs for the lowest pay. They dug canals, built railroads, unloaded docks, cleaned streets, and entered domestic service. But the city gave them one thing Ireland had denied them: numbers. In Ireland, a starving tenant could be evicted, ignored, or replaced. In America, that same tenant could become a voter. And when thousands of them lived in the same neighborhood, attended the same churches, drank in the same saloons, worked the same docks, and remembered the same hunger, they became more than immigrants. They became a bloc. This was the first great Irish-American political transformation. The Irish realized that democracy was not only an ideal, it was a machine, and machines could be operated. In the crowded wards of New York, Boston, Philadelphia, and Chicago, Irish organizers began to understand the city at street level. They knew who needed coal in winter. They knew whose son needed a job. They knew which widow needed rent money. They knew who had just arrived from Ireland and needed help becoming a citizen. This was not abstract politics. This was survival politics. The Irish did not wait for polite reformers to rescue them. They traded unity.
The phrase was simple: to the victor belong the spoils. In practice, it meant that political winners rewarded loyal supporters with jobs, contracts, favors, and protection. For wealthy reformers, this system represented everything wrong with democracy. But for poor immigrants, it often represented the first ladder out of desperation. The Irish political machine understood something powerful. A hungry voter does not need a lecture about civic virtue. He needs work. He needs rent. He needs food. He needs someone who can help when the law is distant and the landlord is close. The ward boss became the bridge between the immigrant and the city. He attended weddings. He visited wakes. He found jobs. He helped with naturalization. He offered emergency relief. He knew the names of families, streets, churches, and saloons. In return, he asked for loyalty. Not casual support, loyalty. On election day, Irish neighborhoods moved like armies. This was not accidental. The trauma of famine had produced a political culture built on collective discipline. The Irish knew what happened when poor people were isolated. They knew what happened when families had no protection. They knew what happened when power belonged only to landlords, aristocrats, and distant officials. So they built a new kind of power. Not noble, not always clean, but effective. The Irish
No organization symbolized this new power more than Tammany Hall. Founded long before the famine, Tammany became the most famous political machine in New York City. By the late 19th century, it was deeply connected to immigrant politics, especially Irish-American power. Tammany was not simply a building. It was a network, a pipeline from the docks to the ballot box, from the tenement to City Hall, from hunger to influence. It helped immigrants become citizens. It found them jobs. It distributed aid. It rewarded loyalty. And yes, it also became famous for corruption, bribery, favoritism, and political manipulation. The most infamous symbol was Boss Tweed, whose ring stole enormous sums from New York City. But the machine survived because it understood something reformers often ignored. People do not only vote for clean government. They vote for whoever shows up when their child is hungry. This was the Irish advantage. They had learned politics not from textbooks, but from survival. They had been oppressed by a powerful empire. They understood hierarchy. They understood patronage. They understood how elites protected each other. And they understood that moral appeals alone rarely defeat organized power. So they built counterpower. The Irish ward boss became an American political archetype. He was local, personal, emotional, transactional, and loyal. He did not speak like an aristocrat. He spoke like the people on his block. He knew suffering because his own family had suffered. And when he attacked the elite, his audience believed him because they had seen elite indifference before. Tammany Hall turned Irish memory into political infrastructure. The famine had taught the Irish that being invisible could be fatal. The machine made them impossible to ignore.
The machine did more than win elections. It changed the social position of an entire people. Public jobs became stepping stones. Police departments, fire departments, sanitation departments, courts, schools, and city offices became places where Irish Americans could gain stable income, social respect, and political influence. A city job meant a regular wage. A regular wage meant rent. Rent meant stability. Stability meant education. Education meant the next generation could rise. This was how the Irish moved from slums into the American middle class. Not instantly, not perfectly, and not without conflict, but steadily. The Irish understood that public works were not just roads, bridges, sewers, and buildings. They were employment systems. Every construction project meant jobs. Every city department meant appointments. Every election meant negotiation. This was the genius of machine politics. It converted demographic density into bargaining power. The Irish did not have to convince the old elite to love them. They only had to make the old elite need them. By the late 19th century, presidential candidates could not ignore Irish voters. In close elections, Irish American communities in major cities could influence outcomes, especially in states with large urban populations. The Irish vote became a prize. Politicians courted it. Parties feared losing it. Newspapers debated it. Churches influenced it. Ward bosses delivered it. The famine generation had arrived as refugees. Their children became the gatekeepers of urban democracy.
But Irish power did not only transform politics, it transformed religion in America. Before the massive Irish migration, the United States was culturally dominated by Protestant institutions. Catholicism was often treated with suspicion, even hostility. The Irish changed that by numbers, discipline, and visibility. They built churches. They built schools. They built charities. They built newspapers. They built political alliances. In the American imagination, Catholicism slowly moved from foreign threat to urban force. This did not happen because prejudice disappeared. It happened because Irish Catholics organized so effectively that they could no longer be excluded. The church became more than a religious institution. It became a community center, a welfare network, a school system, a cultural fortress, a political meeting ground.
Priests, ward bosses, labor leaders, and family networks often operated in overlapping worlds. Together, they gave Irish neighborhoods structure. This was the Green Machine, a fusion of memory, faith, ethnicity, labor, and politics. And at its center was one message. Never again would Irish people depend on the mercy of distant elites. They would build institutions of their own.
The final symbol of Irish American ascent was not a ward boss. It was a president. John F. Kennedy was not just a charismatic young politician from Massachusetts. He was the living answer to a century of insult. His family story traced back to famine-era Irish migration. Like many Irish families, the Kennedys transformed poverty, exclusion, and ethnic identity into ambition, education, wealth, and public office. By the time Kennedy ran for president in 1960, anti-Catholic prejudice still existed in American life. Many voters wondered whether a Catholic president would be loyal to the Constitution or to the Pope. Kennedy confronted that fear directly. He did not run away from his Catholic identity. He reframed it. He presented himself as modern, patriotic, disciplined, and American. When he won, it was more than an electoral victory. It was psychological validation for generations of Irish Catholics who had been told they did not belong. The journey from Coffin Ships to the White House was complete. But it had not happened by accident. It happened because Irish Americans built political machines, controlled neighborhoods, entered public service, mastered elections, funded campaigns, created institutions, and taught their children that power was not something to admire from a distance. Power was something to capture. Kennedy represented the polished version of a much rougher history. Behind the elegance of Camelot was the memory of hunger. Behind the speeches was the ward meeting. Behind the presidency was the precinct captain. Behind the dynasty was the immigrant ship. The Irish had turned survival into strategy, and strategy into national power. Irish American political leadership developed a distinct style. It was emotional, direct, moral, and combative. It did not speak only about efficiency. It spoke about dignity. The memory of hunger gave Irish politics a special sensitivity to exclusion, poverty, and institutional neglect. This did not mean every Irish politician was progressive. Many were conservative. Many defended their own power fiercely. Many machines excluded others, even while helping their own. But the rhetorical pattern remained powerful. The little man against the powerful. The neighborhood against the elite. The worker against the boss. The immigrant against the gatekeeper. The forgotten against the system. This style helped shape labor politics, urban reform, Catholic social teaching, and later debates over social welfare, civil rights, public education, housing, and healthcare. The Irish story became part of America's larger argument over what government is for. Is government only a referee, or is it a shield for people crushed by forces bigger than themselves? For the famine generation, the answer was obvious. A government that does nothing while people starve is not neutral. It is taking a side. That belief still echoes in modern policy debates. Whenever politicians argue over social safety nets, immigrant rights, public jobs, affordable housing, labor protection, or urban investment, they are speaking in a political language partly shaped by the Irish experience. The Great Hunger did not only move bodies across an ocean, it moved ideas into American democracy. The Irish were not the last marginalized group to discover the power of organization. They were one of the first to prove how effective it could be in the American city. Today, immigrant groups, labor movements, tenant unions, civil rights organizations, faith communities, and grassroots campaigns still use versions of the same blueprint. First, build community identity. Second, solve immediate problems. Third, register voters. Fourth,
control neighborhoods. 5th, negotiate with power. 6th, turn local victories into national influence. The tools have changed. The ward boss has been replaced by the organizer, the nonprofit, the union, the digital campaign, the WhatsApp group, the church network, the mosque network, the community center, and the social media page. But the logic remains familiar. People who are ignored individually can become powerful collectively. In 2026, American politics is still deeply shaped by urban organizing. Cities remain engines of demographic change, immigrant power, labor activism, housing struggles, and policy experimentation. National debates often begin locally. A rent fight in one city becomes a housing platform. A school board campaign becomes a national culture war. A worker strike becomes a labor movement. A migrant community becomes a voting bloc. A neighborhood demand becomes a presidential talking point. This is the Irish lesson in modern form. Power listens when numbers become organized. The famine taught Irish Americans that hunger without organization leads to death. America taught them that organization without apology leads to power.
But this story should not be romanticized. Political machines were not pure. They could be corrupt. They could be violent. They could silence opposition. They could protect criminals. They could exchange public money for private loyalty. And Irish political power, once established, did not always welcome the next wave of outsiders. Groups that had once been hated sometimes became gatekeepers themselves. This is one of the hardest truths in immigrant history. Survival does not automatically create justice. Sometimes it creates empathy. Sometimes it creates fear. Sometimes it creates a determination to protect your own group first. The Irish machine gave poor immigrants a ladder, but it also taught America that democracy could be managed, manipulated, and bought. So the legacy is complicated. It is both inspiring and uncomfortable. It is the story of oppressed people learning to fight back, and the story of what happens when fighting back becomes a system of power.
A potato rotted in the soil of Ireland, and the consequences reached all the way to the White House. The Great Hunger killed, scattered, and traumatized a people. But it also created a political memory so powerful that it crossed the Atlantic and reshaped American democracy. The Irish arrived in America with almost nothing. No wealth, no status, no welcome, no protection. But they had numbers. They had churches. They had neighborhoods. They had memory. And eventually, they had votes. They learned that in America, power did not always belong to the most noble, the most educated, or the most respected. Sometimes, power belonged to whoever could organize the forgotten. The famine generation did not simply survive. They created a method. From hunger to ships. From ships to slums. From slums to wards. From wards to city halls. From city halls to the presidency. The Irish-American story is not just an immigrant success story. It is a warning and a blueprint. A warning that when governments ignore suffering, they create political forces they cannot control. And a blueprint showing that marginalized people, when organized, can rewrite the future of a nation. The Great Hunger did not end in Ireland. It entered America. And it changed the country forever.